This happened last year, but it was not until this year that things became disturbing. I used to live in a big house, a Queenslander, as it's known for its design. It was an old wooden home with 2 levels, propped up by a separate dwelling underneath it. I lived with my girlfriend upstairs. It was just for the majority. We did have one roommate for a bit, but she left. We rented, and our real estate agents told us there may be possums in the roof, which wasn't uncommon, and we did hear them every now and then, usually fighting and screeching like no tomorrow. Sometimes, we heard them scurry around, which was also not unusual. It's only when the night came around did sounds become more unconventional. One thing possums don't do is scratch or knock. They have rather soft feet and are not known to scratch or make any sort of noise like that. But every few nights we would hear scratching and knocking above our heads in the bed, and at the time, it was very annoying. Some nights it was a little bit stranger. It was in the roof itself, rather than the walls, and it was the distinct sound of walking, but not the plodding of 4 feet, but the plodding of 2. It sounded like a slow walk from one end of the roof to the other, like a small person walking. There was weight to it that sounded too human to be an animal. Possums are small and nimble, and rather hard to be heard unless they really cause a ruckus. We largely ignored it because none of us were game to actually check the roof through the manhole. I often made jokes about there being gnomes in the roof, so none of us took it seriously. It wasn't until we begun moving out that we noticed something about the manhole that was not the same as it had ever been. There were a lot of hand and feet footprints all around it. We used to sleep in that room and would stare at the roof a lot, but never did we ever see any marks on it. I'm still not sure who or what exactly was in that roof, but I don't ever want to find out. Context. I grew up my entire childhood without a father. When I turned 15, I got really into hunting and just enjoyed guns in general. My uncle is an avid hunter, gun builder, and ammunition reloader. He loves to hunt. This was a common interest that made us become very close. He was my father figure and taught me a lot that made me the man that I am today. Now to the story. My uncle's father lives in Montana, which allowed us to get resident pricing on big game hunting tags. Once a year, we would head up to his property and hunt for a week. Usually, this would go off without a hitch, and if we were lucky, we would get the shot we were looking for. Unfortunately, not this year. Just like every other year, we headed up to his father's property in northern Montana. That night, we headed out to go set up some hunting cameras so that we knew there were deer in the area, so we knew it was a good place to hunt. It must have been 1 o'clock a.m., and we were driving down this 2-lane dirt road, headed into the woods. We were always the only people on the road, since it was so early in the morning. This particular time, we saw a headlight approaching from behind us, and thought nothing of it. We figured they must have been doing the same thing as us. After tailing us for some time, the headlights disappeared, which was strange since there were no turns on this particular road. A few seconds go by and all of a sudden, we see the truck driving on the shoulder to our right with the lights off. The shoulder was a small hill with a brush and a fence fairly close to it. Definitely something that nobody should be driving on. The truck speeds up and gets back on the road, turns its lights back on, and speeds off into the darkness. This set off some red flags, but we figured they were just impatient and wanted to get there before us. No big deal, or so we thought. We drove down the road for a few more miles until we saw taillights stopped in the middle of the road. It was the truck that passed us a few miles back. They had set up traffic cones to completely block off the road, and there was another truck parked on the shoulder. We figured that they must have broken down, so we stopped. I had read an article online earlier this year about people in other countries that would make roadblocks to rob and kill people for their vehicles and belongings. I laughed and started to tell my uncle about this article when two men from each truck jumped out of their vehicles and started to approach ours. My uncle always kept two handguns on the shoulder holster under his arms when we were out doing these kinds of things. This saved our lives. Two of the men stayed at the tailgate of the truck parked on the road, and the other two men came up to his window. At this point, my uncle has his right hand in his jacket with his hand holding the gun. The men were extremely friendly and said the truck on the shoulder had broken down, and they were just helping him out. They asked if my uncle knew anything about cars and if he could come and take a look at the problem. My uncle refused, and this made the men angry. Both instantly drew pistols, and one of the men rounded the front of the truck towards my window. My uncle grabbed the man's gun that was pointed at him, which he forgot to load a round into, luckily for us. My uncle pulled his gun out and shot the man in the shoulder and slammed on the gas, driving on the left shoulder, and past all of the men. I looked back and could see the three other men gathering around the man my uncle shot. We drove and drove and drove for what seemed like an eternity without saying a word to each other. We drove back to his dad's house and he told me to go to bed. He called the police and told them what had happened. They sent out 2 officers to the house to take his statement and mentioned to him that they had quite a few reports of roadblocks being set up all around northern Montana. They were able to catch all 4 of the men who stopped us that night.